What's up, YouTube? I'm Nick Householder. So I just got back home from DragonCon. DragonCon is a giant pop culture convention. It's held every year on Labor Day weekend in Atlanta, Georgia. And I've been going probably 7 years, but this is the first year that I was able to be a part of the convention as a panelist. And I wanted to document that and share it with you. The first thing I did was be a part of the Sulfur X Variety Show. The Sulfur X Variety Show is this science comedy mashup event where they put comedians and science entertainers together and basically share science in a fun and entertaining way. The next thing I did was the Hands-On Science Power Hour, where I got to do hands-on science demonstrations with people just like you. It's basically the types of stuff that we get to do on the channel where I build these science demonstrations, but instead of just showing it to people, people got to interact with it one-on-one, and it was a lot of fun. The last thing I did was this solo talk that I'm about to show you. The title of my talk was How to Communicate Ideas Through Your Builds. I wanted to share how I design and build science demonstrations. It takes a lot to think about how to properly communicate a scientific concept through a thing that you and I don't get to really interact with. I'm showing you something. And I wanted to break down my process of how I think about sharing science through something that I build. So I put together this video of my talk, edited it down a little bit for time, so you can see the talk that I gave at the convention. Let me know what you think in the comments. My name is Nick. I design and I build things, and I tend to build sciencey things, at least for now. But I pretty much like to think I can make anything, but what has been really exciting about the last couple of years is that everything I've made has had to be something that I could use as a teaching tool. And so every time we had to think about how to make something, it had to be through the lens of how do you communicate an idea through something that you made. I'm an aerospace engineer. I have a master's degree from Auburn University. Science demonstrations is what I've been able to do as a job for the last couple of years now, and I find myself very lucky, but a lot of that just comes down to being in the right place at the right time and taking all of those skills that I built up making stuff in my garage by myself and turning it into something that I could do as a job. Before I stumbled my way into television, I was a weapons test engineer for the Air Force. So I did basically large-scale science experiments. So weapons test engineering, it was focused on the idea of testing something to make sure that it works, making sure that you know how it's supposed to function. And really the biggest thing that I learned from that was how to conduct really big, scary tests and do it safely. And I think that approaching everything you do with the mindset that you don't want to blow somebody up is probably a good idea. I got my big break on a Science Channel show called Street Science. The premise of that show was we would do large-scale science demonstrations out on the street, at schools, at bars, at restaurants, and a lot of times we just show up unexpectedly. And the benefit that we got from that was that we would be able to show up and see people's natural reactions to a big, crazy science demonstration. And their reactions were a great way of connecting to people at home. Because when you're trying to do something like science education or science outreach, you want to reach maybe not the guy that has the physics PhD, but somebody that wants to know more about science, and you want to show it to them in a cool way. So I really liked the aspect of Street Science where we were just using, it was average Joes getting to see what we were making and sharing with them. And then, as luck would have it, one of the main hosts on the show is Jimmy Fallon's science guy. His name is Kevin Delaney. Kevin has a background in theater and writing, and so is a fantastic presenter with a love of science. But his background doesn't allow him to design and build the science demos, so he's built up a team around him that can do those things. So I'm like the physics side of things, and we've got a girl who does all the chemistry and that sort of thing. And so I managed to be able to build things for Jimmy and get really big reactions out of that organization, and it's been wonderful. And so I'm going to try to share with you some science demonstrations. So I figure I don't want to just sit here. I want to show you guys some stuff too. So I'm going to show you one of my favorites. So that demo I love because it seems like it shouldn't make sense. You've got a high-powered leaf blower, blowing on something, and you see it go into the air, and your brain tells you that that should be sailing across the room. But instead, it manages to lock in the air and float there. So the big question is, how do you get across an idea through a thing that you've built, right? I told you my application, that's science. I want to share 2 key aerodynamic principles, and so I float a giant ball in the air. But other applications of this are things like product design and graphic design, like how do you communicate with somebody who wants to interact with something that you've built, how to use it appropriately? Or how do you communicate the idea of a brand just by looking at a logo, right? You want to be able to communicate non-verbally with people, and I think that this process that I use is valuable for that. I like to call it hook, line, and thinker. So it's cheesy, but you'll remember it. The hook, the idea there is you have something to catch somebody's attention. A giant floating ball in the air does a really good job of that. People pay attention. You want to deliver information concisely and clearly, and you want to leave room for the person who interacts with your build to be able to think about what you've shared with them and come to their own conclusions about it. So the hook, you want to catch their attention. Fire and explosions help. I definitely have relied on that in the past. It's a staple of any science type television show that you might come across. There's a big explosion during the commercial break, and it makes you want to come back and see more. But that works with anything. If you're walking through a crowded hall and somebody does something flashy, it catches your attention. But that also applies to bright colors and font choices. So you'll see, if you've got a big panel that you have to interact with a machine and there's a very important button, chances are it's brightly colored and it's got big letters to tell you what it is that it does, like stop. You want to draw people in. You want people to pay attention to what it is you want to show them. There's stuff fighting for your attention all the time, and it kind of feels like a little bit of an arms race some of the time. It would be nice to simply share something with someone, but you can't forget that you have to get somebody to look first before you can share. The line. You want to share information clear and concisely. I like this example here of a stop sign. We have been conditioned to understand what that color and that word means, and so you can apply it into other applications and people understand what it means. So those are switches used on heavy scale machinery and power tools to be able to stop them while they're working, especially table saws where you can get your hands caught and stuff, and it can get real bad if you can't get to the stop button. So distilling the information that you have into its clearest form is really valuable. And I try to think of it as a whelm, don't overwhelm sort of approach. I know there is a desire, I know I have a problem with just word vomit if I'm trying to explain something and just going on and on and on. But if you have the time to craft something to share, then you can take the time to think about how to say it as clearly as possible and let somebody lead somebody into what it is you want to share with them. Like I said, you want to leave that room, that time for somebody to think about what you've shared and let them come to a conclusion. People tend to remember and tend to internalize things that they reason out themselves better than something that you tell them. So we just did that floating ball demonstration, and I told you a little bit about the science that's in there, but I'm sure your head's gonna start turning and thinking, what are some other applications of that? Where have I seen stuff that flies before? Maybe the Bernoulli principle and the Coanda effect have something to do with how airplanes fly. Maybe I should look that up. It does. Being able to do something like that, I find to be the best way to teach. Let somebody come to it in and of themselves. But that being said, from my side at least, when you are doing a science demonstration, you can come back and then reinforce that after there's been a little bit of time to think, to really drive home what you wanted to share, like saying, hey, that stuff works on airplanes too. A really great example that I like is the idea of the catapult as a science demonstration to do with kids. You have a catapult similar to this that has different settings for tension, arm length, where the arm stops and that sort of thing. And you give that to a group of people or a group of kids and you say, make this shoot the same way every time. And then you just let them go. And what happens over time is you play around with the catapult and you find the right settings and dial in your process for how you pull the arm back, how you release the arm, where you set everything, and then you start getting repeatable results. What people have done by doing that is the scientific method. They isolated variables, they controlled for those variables, and then they were able to get repeatable results from that. This, I feel, is a way more intuitive way of teaching that idea as opposed to just writing it up on the board. And people will remember it, especially if after everybody's had a chance to shoot the catapult for a while, you can come back and say like, hey, you just did what a scientist does every day. Wasn't that fun? Wouldn't you like to do that? Or if nothing else, help. Exactly. Or if nothing else, you instill an appreciation and a knowledge of how that works into someone who might not have understood it another way. So I wanted to go through a couple of the demos that I've done and talk about at least how I view the hook, line, and thinker aspect of that demo. The vacuum flamethrower. The hook, of course, is that there's a giant fireball right there, and you wonder, how did that happen? What caused that to work? And then we get to share that fuel, which might not make a big fireball, like if you take a cup of gasoline, it's just gonna burn if you light it. But when you aerosolize it, it burns much differently. And the way that things burn changes when you distribute the molecules into the air. The specific story that we were testing and working around was somebody that vacuumed up gasoline out of their car with a broken vacuum cleaner and caused a pretty big fire. And we were curious to see how that happened and why. So this was our experiment to figure it out. Sebastian, the science stuntman, did not survive. Well, he did, but he was very burned. It was kind of sad. But it's big and interesting, and it's fun, and it gives you some time to think about, internal combustion engines work by aerosolizing gasoline before combusting them. They don't just drip gas into the pistons. So thinking about all the different applications for aerosolizing a fuel and what kind of result you might get from that is a fun way to think about a cool fireball coming out of a vacuum cleaner. Another one we did was to try to replicate Galileo's ball drop demonstration, looking to see if objects of different mass will fall at the same rate. What was really interesting, and I don't have any pictures of it at the moment, is that two equally sized objects that weighed different amounts hit the ground at different times, which is, goes kind of counter to the classic way that you would describe it in physics. But the reason that happens is air resistance. That air resistance acts on objects differently because of their weight. It's pushing the same amount, but they weigh different amounts, so they fall at different speeds. But what we got to was if we got objects massive enough where the scale of the fall was not significant enough for air resistance to play a big part, they hit the ground at approximately the same time. Or you got to do it in the vacuum. Yeah, we discussed going to the moon to do this, but the Discovery Channel did not want to fly us to the moon, as it turned out. Danger of combustible gases. This was like we talked about the grill, just how dangerous something that you interact with on a day-to-day basis can be. The hook is, of course, the fire again. And what we got to discuss was the concept of stoichiometry, specifically the perfect ratio of a gas to oxygen, or in this case air, to get the highest amount of concussive blast out of it. And this was again investigating something that had happened out in the real world. Somebody had left a grill in their back seat with the valve open and lit up a cigarette and blew out all the windows of their car. And we wanted to see if we could do the same thing. So we took an old Honda Civic out to a bomb range and blew it up. And it was a lot of fun. And being able to talk about something as critical to chemistry as stoichiometry while blowing up a car was fun and interesting. It's such a great way to tell the story of atmospheric pressure. Again, the hook is something big, something flashy, something loud. That drum, you feel it in your chest when it collapses. And we specifically, the more classic science demonstration version of this is to do a single 55-gallon oil drum and crush it. And we welded 3 together just so we could get a bigger drum. But I'll tell you, it makes a big thump. The line here is that atmospheric pressure is pressing on you all the time, but you might not feel it. And when we evacuate all the air out of this tank and we boil water on the inside and then cap it and then dunk it in ice, and thereby when we cool it, that reduces the pressure inside of the tank. We get to talk about, the changes in pressure that happen with temperature, and we get to talk about atmospheric pressure at the same time. And people get to see that in a very physical way. You get to see me jump and scream when it goes off. So this was the most recent thing I did for the Tonight Show. Laser ignited hydrogen balloons. Again, fire. Note a pattern here. We wanted to find a good way of communicating that light is energy and that it is being transmitted and that light gets absorbed by objects. And we wanted to try to scale that up in a way that was visible. So what I did is I found that a high-powered laser was capable of igniting flash paper, which is something called nitrocellulose. It's just a really flammable paper material, and you can dye it colors other than white because it usually comes as paper or cotton. So I basically colored it black with a Sharpie and then hit it with a high-powered laser, and it goes off. So starting with that, we said, okay, what's gonna look cool with that? And a balloon full of hydrogen seemed like a pretty good choice. So it was fun to do this long line of hydrogen balloons, blow them all up in a row. It's again loud, it's bright, but you, in this very flashy way, get to share the transmission of energy. The car crash slingshot was a little bit of fun. We basically made this slingshot contraption to hurl objects from the back seat into your head, just to see what it would do. But the intro to this is some footage of stuff smacking him in the back of the head and going splat and going everywhere. The soda can was particularly fun because it fizzes and spins off. And a lot of it impacted his head with a significant amount of force. We had some measuring devices on his head to determine the G load, and it hit like 50 Gs when you'd hit him with a can of soup. So that's no fun. And we got to talk about how objects are inside of a car, though you might be sitting still, feel like they are all moving. Everything is moving at the same speed, and if you were to stop, all of those objects continue to go forward. And so we had this, silly contraption that illustrated that point. I liked this one a lot. It kind of comes from me being an engineer, though. It's a self-supporting bridge. It's a bunch of planks that there's no nails. They just rest on top of each other and use friction to hold themselves in place. And what I really liked about it was that all of these volunteers that were out on the street that day, they built the bridge. I got to just kind of show them how to do it. So I got this very fun interaction where it doesn't, in my opinion, it didn't translate on camera as well as a science demonstration, but it worked really well for the people that were there that day. So sometimes people interact with the thing that you make and don't just see it. And having something like that where they go through the motion of putting something together, it taught them about what it is that was going on here and how the friction held this bridge together. And we were able to support, 4 full-grown adults on a self-supporting bridge with no nails, and was able to support that nice arch shape. This is the time they set me on fire. Again, a pattern here. We were teaching about insulation and how stunt performers are able to stay safe while lighting themselves on fire. I really love things like this because it's such a big dichotomy between two things that you know, right? I know that my arm is gonna burn if I light it on fire, and I know that fire is hot, and so how is it possible that my arm can be on fire and I'm not in pain? And having something that kind of shocks the senses and is maybe a little surprising is a good way to catch attention and really drive home something that you learn from that. And I think one of the reasons that stuff like that tends to be so valuable. Cling wrap tug of war. We used cling wrap to stick a car to a light post and then did a tug of war between the two cars and could not get that car off the light post even though we were spinning the tires, though we were eventually able to break the tug of war down. That came mostly because the friction of the tire was rubbing on the plastic and eventually cut through it. So had there been some sort of guard or something up, I don't think we ever would have broken that cling wrap. I mean, you see an image like this, somebody peeling out their tires and trying to do a tug of war with cars, and it's inviting. You want to know what's going on, and we're able to show how multiple layers of material are able to build strength together. It's why you can easily break a human hair, but if you put a bunch of them together, it's really hard to snap it. The same thing here with a bunch of cling wrap. The magnet crusher. This was a favorite of mine, mostly because the slow motion footage that came off of this was amazing. So we took two really high strength neodymium magnets and put them in a couple of channels and shoved them together and destroyed some stuff. The thing that I felt was so valuable from this is we were talking about how the strength of a magnet gets stronger the closer the magnets get together, that it's an exponential thing as opposed to a constant amount of pull force. And so when you see the slow-mo, the magnets slowly creep together, and in the last couple of seconds they just slam together and you get these wonderful shots of crushing an egg and Doritos and grapes. The teacup I think was my favorite though, because it shot up out of the in between the magnets, and then the magnets exploded instead of the teacup. So I feel like we had the one sentient teacup in the world, and it jumped out of its demise. This is another demo from the last time I did the Tonight Show, and it was this fluidized sand. The way that it works is you create a network of tubes underneath a grainy substance like sand, but it works in other granular solids. And you pump gas up underneath of it, and that gas helps to eliminate the internal friction of that pile of sand, and so the sand molecules are more easily able to slide past one another. So it begins to behave like a fluid instead of like sand. So you sink down into it if you're standing in it. Buoyant objects float to the surface if they're buried in it, and it's just a shock to the senses to see something that you think of as being solid, like dirt, and see it behave in such a strange way. I also really enjoyed Jimmy's reaction because he just kind of stood there in shock and looked at it, and it was a lot of fun. Oh yeah, I have one more demo. I figured I'd give somebody a chance to try out what we did on the Tonight Show. So who wants to try out the toilet paper cannon? Come on up. Squeeze the trigger, don't let go.
Okay.
There you go. Thanks, sir.
Awesome.
The other big thing that's happened recently is there's an organization called the Midnight Science Club. They're an organization that houses the world's largest collection of science demonstrations. The man who curates it is Mr. Wizard's apprentice. He has basically all of Mr. Wizard's science demonstrations in a large library warehouse mini television studio, and he's been looking for a way to break back into media using YouTube and social media as a platform. So the Midnight Science Club is the avenue that we're trying to use to do that. If you're interested in it, the Midnight Science Club has a Facebook group, and they do a monthly live stream where they bring together a bunch of Nobel laureates and astronauts and physicists and kids and entertainers, and bring everybody together and kind of have like a clubhouse meeting where everybody sits around and talks about science, and kind of the way that they want it to be is like you get a bunch of friends together who all happen to have this common interest of science demonstrations and science, and they get to talk about it, and you get to watch that and learn from the scientists as they interact with each other. And I think there's a lot of value there from that. In addition to that, they have on their website a bunch of science activities that you can do with Girl Scout troops, Boy Scout troops, after school programs. If you live in the middle of nowhere with nothing to do and you want to do something cool and sciencey, they have a whole section like of stuff to do, basically, that lets you explore science. I think that might be it. Thank you.